Well, it's good to see you all again. I'm Maurice and I've got another study for you. I'm excited because I'm starting a new series, 6,000 Years of Babylon. It was almost 20 years ago when I filmed 10 talks on 6,000 Years of Babylon because I've been amazed how it's advanced over the last 200 years. I've been studying it from the 1960s, so a long, long time. And since that time, I've seen it come out of secrecy, where people thought it was a crackpot conspiracy theory, to an indisputable fact. Politicians, world leaders are talking about the one world order, and it's undeniable now. Everyone can see that it's happening. But over the last 10 years, I've seen it escalate at an amazing rate. And 10 years ago, so 10 years after I first did the 6,000 Years of Babylon, I wrote 5 books on it. That's book number 3. And there are 5 books covering all these series. And I think there were about 50 studies that I did. But that was 10 years ago, and I've felt prompted by God to go through it again and maybe add some things and bring it up to date. Well, this whole series is to expose the principles on which the system and foundations of Babylon are built on, and also how it's manifest in history. You know, God's plan and Satan's plan are the same. Maybe that will surprise you, but I'm convinced that God's plan, Satan's plan are the same, but one is counterfeit and one is real. Satan is not the opposite of God. He wants to be like God. And so he's the counterfeit. So he's got the same plan to take over the world. Jesus one day is going to come and take over this planet and rule with a rod of iron. But that's Satan's job. He wants an antichrist to rule the whole world for him. Hitler had a 1,000-year Reich. That's a counterfeit for the 1,000-year millennium. Well, I want to show that in any age, if I can teach you the principles, so in any age, in any situation, in any cultural setting, you'll be able to discern the spirit of Babylon. That's what the whole plan of the series, so you will know where we're up to in world history. And Babylon's going to be judged soon. We're in the last of the last days, and we know in Revelation 18, it says that Babylon will be judged. And the whole system collapses. But with Babylon, it's not just the religious system, the whole political and cultural system, it all collapses. It's an amazing read if you read Revelation 18. It lists a whole bunch, a whole half chapter of commodities that fall, oil and wheat and thyme and cumin and all herbs and culture and music, and everything will finish. So can you tell the difference between God's system and the counterfeit? Many can't. Many Christians can't tell the difference. They're in Babylon and don't realise it. And in these last days the call is to come out. So let me read you from Jeremiah 51. I've called this first study God's Golden Cup. Babylon was God's golden cup. Now that's a strange thing for God to say. It's my golden cup. Jeremiah 51 verse 5 to 9. For Israel hath not been forsaken, nor Judah of his God, of the Lord of hosts, though their land was filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel. Flee out of the midst of Babylon. Now, this is Jeremiah talking to Israel, but he's talking about the last days. He's talking about the days we're in now. I know it happened at other times, but Revelation and prophecy is cyclic, so it keeps happening. And this is for the last days. And it's the same call to the bride of Christ. Flee out of the midst of Babylon and deliver every man his soul. Be not cut off in her iniquity, for this is the time of the Lord's vengeance. This is the great day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's vengeance. He will render unto her a recompense. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations are drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. God has made all nations, that's all nations, so every nation in the whole earth, God has caused her to drink the cup of Babylon. That's amazing. Let me read that again. Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. It's God that has made all the nations drink of the cup of Babylon, and they're besotted, they're drunk with the spirit of Babylon. I can see it everywhere. Once you learn the principles, you can spot it in politics, in music, in religion, in Christianity. It's permeated every nation. And it carries on verse 8. Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. In 1 hour in Revelation it said she'll come to naught. Howl for her, take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she's not healed. Forsake her, and let us go every one to his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies. That's very similar to the description in Revelation. Her sins have reached up to heaven and she's going to be judged. That's a prophecy of Israel for the last days. They need to come out of Babylon as well as the church. Well, we're not going to read Revelation 18, and we'll come to that in subsequent studies. But Revelation 18, I suggest you read it because it will give you an understanding of the magnitude of Babylon and how it will fall. Well, maybe that you find that hard to believe that God would make all nations drunk of the wine of Babylon. But you know, God has handed his people and the whole world over to Babylon. Daniel 4:17. We'll look at it in the next studies, how that God has made Nebuchadnezzar the King of Kings. But Daniel 4:17. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, this matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones. This was when Nebuchadnezzar was made into a beast. He said, is this not great Babylon that I have built? That's the ethos of Nimrod. Let's build a tower and make a name for ourselves. And Nebuchadnezzar came to the culmination of Babylon again, and he said, it's not this great Babylon that I have made. And God humbled him, and he ate grass like a wild beast, and he had feathers, he grew feathers like an eagle. Unbelievable, he became a beast. And God says it's to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever he will, and setteth over it the basest of men. That's amazing. So God rules in the affairs of men, but he sets up the basest of men. It's Hitler and Mussolini and Genghis Khan and all these despots throughout history. God has ruled in the affairs of men, and he set over the nations the basest of men. This is what the Bible said. Can you ever think when a holy, godly man ruled empires? I can't. So from Nimrod, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, to the Black Pope and the Antichrist, God sets up the basest of men over Babylon and over the world. You know, we're learning principles in these first two studies, and Babylon is to give God's people, or all people, an alternative. You know, if you can only worship God, you'll only worship God, because we were made to worship. If you don't worship the real God, you'll worship things that he created. You'll worship idols, or you'll worship yourself, or a film star, a pop star. You can't not worship. And so God has to give us an alternative. If you don't want the real God, and you don't want to worship him in spirit and in truth, then you'll worship an alternative. Anything other than worship to the true God is the spirit of Babylon. It started in the Garden of Eden. I think study number 3 is it all started with Eve. She was the first one to choose herself instead of God. She worshipped herself. I'll do what I want. God said, don't eat the fruit, but I want to eat it. So she started alternative worship. Worship is to do with obedience. We'll look at music and see that it's nothing to do with worship in later studies. Worship is to do with obedience. Worship means to bow the knee, to kiss the hand, to subject yourself, be obedient to. So worship's to do with obedience, and she disobeyed God, which is the counterfeit worship, and that's the spirit of Babylon. And if you don't worship the real God, it's the spirit of Babylon. They were dancing round a golden calf, Israel. It was the spirit of Babylon. They thought they were worshipping the real God, but you can't worship the real God through a golden calf, or Mary, or one of the saints, or Buddha, or anyone else. So historians, Christian historians, throughout the last few hundred years have claimed that the Catholic Church is Babylon. Well, I've got quotes from cardinals who say that, the Catholic religion is really the religion of Babylon. They accept that, and of course it is. But the Catholic Church is only part of it. As soon as you have religion, as soon as Christians who are an organism become an organisation, you bring politics in, you bring voting, you bring financing, you bring business principles. That's the spirit of Babylon as soon as you do that. So it's not just the Catholic Church, it's all religions, and it's all businesses and all commerce, and it's all culture, and it's all politics. It's much bigger than most Christians realise. So only a relationship with God is true worship. Jesus explained it to the woman at the well. Let's read it, John 4:23. I've alluded to the scripture. The woman at the well said, you worship, talking to Jesus, you worship God in Jerusalem, but we worship in Samaria because we're Israel. And Jesus says, forget the place, forget culture and politics and business, forget everything. The hour cometh and now is, when true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. You can't worship God through religion. Even Christianity, you've got to worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, Babylon, the spirit of Babylon is also so that God can draw a remnant people out for himself. I'll explain that in later studies. But God put his people in Babylon. We know that Israel were backslidden. They were passing their own children to demons, Molech and Baal and Ashtaroth. And God sent them into Babylon, but only as punishment. And then he called a remnant out. All those that went into Babylon didn't come out. Those that had a willing heart, those that were willing to pay the price, to leave where they'd settled, married, had wives, businesses, children, friends. Those that were willing to leave Babylon at great cost and go and start a new life in a new country that maybe they weren't born in because they'd been 70 years in Babylon, and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We'll talk about that in later studies. But Revelation 18:4. God always calls his people out of Babylon. He puts us in, not to keep us in, but so that we can come out. And God takes us out to put us in somewhere else. Israel came out of Egypt to put them in the promised land. And God calls people out of Babylon after 70 years to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And that's where we're up to now in world history. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. This is Revelation 18, so it's just before God judges Babylon. It's chapter 18. And before he judges her, he says, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partaker of her sins, and ye receive not of her plagues. God's going to send plagues on the earth. I was talking to my wife this morning, and we were amazed that Christians think that God doesn't put disease on people or send plagues, when it's so clear in the Bible. And the last plagues are going to be from God on this world. God sent the plagues on Israel, sickness and plagues and locusts and disease. I don't know where they get this theology from. They certainly don't get it from the Bible. You know, Abram was called out of Babylon, not the world. When you're born into Egypt, we'll look at that next study, Egypt and Babylon, but we're all born into Egypt, into the world. But when you get into religion, then you're in Babylon. And Abram was called out of Babylon, not out of Egypt. That's interesting. The first one to be called out of Babylon was Abram. He's the father of faith, so he's the first one. Abram started the church. The apostles didn't start the church. The Bible talks about the church in the wilderness, the called out ones, the ecclesia. And Abram was the first to be called out of Babylon, not Egypt. So that's very interesting. And you can't rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. You can't be the bride of Christ. You can't be the wife of God, as Israel were, unless you come out of Babylon. When God divorced Israel, he put them into Babylon. They couldn't stay in Israel anymore. You know, I've written a parallel series. I've written 7 books and there's about 60 studies. Israel, the church, the kingdom of God. And it looks at the other side. We're looking at the spirit of Babylon, but I'm looking at how God called Israel as his wife. And now he's looking for a bride for his son. And it's a plan of romance and love and family life. And you know, the need of all lovers, God's the world's greatest lover, the need of all lovers is that they'll be loved out of a pure heart without force. That's interesting, isn't it? That's how I am. I've got a wife and I don't want to force her. I want love from a pure heart, voluntary. And God's plan is one of love. And those who love him must do so from a free heart. They must have a choice. There must be a Babylon. There must be a Satan, an adversary, to choose God. Well, Babylon is a system of seduction. The devil can't reveal himself like God can because his character is not desirable. So it's a system of seduction, of prostitution. It calls Babylon the whore of Babylon. It's a system of fear, counterfeit worship. But there's a specific aim, and it's for complete domination of the world, so that the whole world will worship Satan through this beast. It's all in Revelation chapter 13. The antichrist sets up an image to the beast and gets the whole world to worship. And if they don't, there's fear. Just like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, when they were confronted with the fiery furnace, you worship the statue or there's a fiery furnace. Deceit first. They were called to a celebration, the dedication of the statue. When they were there, it is commanded you worship. But if you don't, you burn. And so that's the system of Babylon. It needs complete domination. And it's been hidden from the eyes of people from the beginning of history. God calls it mystery. Mystery Babylon. You know, whenever people tell you about a doctrine or something, oh, it's a mystery, just believe it. The warning bells go up in my spirit, because mystery is to do with Babylon. God calls Babylon mystery. Paul was always saying, I'll show you a mystery, I'll reveal a mystery. Paul says the mystery that was hid from the foundation of the world is now revealed to us. The last book in the Bible is called the book of Revelation, not the book of mystery. And mysteries to do with Babylon. Let me read it, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Paul's just said the day won't come, Jesus won't come, and we won't be gathered to him until the man of sin is revealed. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. That spirit of iniquity, that spirit of Babylon has been in the earth since the Garden of Eden. It already works. Only he who now letteth will let until he's taken out of the way. The mystery of iniquity. That's Babylon. It's to do with mystery. All the secret societies are part of Babylon. The mystic secrets of the nations, witchcraft, Buddhism. Enlightenment will show you a mystery. Christianity, true Christianity, following Christ, is revelation, not mystery. But you know, this mystery is hidden from most of its own initiates. Very few Masons know what the top people believe. I worked for a Mason for a while, and he said, we worship God, the creator of the universe. But when you get to higher levels, you find the God who created the universe is Lucifer. They worship Lucifer at the Masons. And many societies at the very top, they worship Satan. But people don't know. They get to a level, and the lower levels of the Masons, they do good deeds, they alms give, and lots of secret societies feed the poor and do good works. It's only when you get to the top. So many of the initiates, many politicians are sincere men. They go into politics and they don't realise the aim. They don't realise that the people at the very, very top, and there are very few of them, they're actually serving Satan and taking over the world for Satan. They don't realise it's just part of the system. They're deceived. How many pastors are preaching doctrines that are doctrines of devils? They're deceived. They don't know. They've got the spirit of Babylon. Well, Babylon's not just a geographical place. We know that Babylonia was an empire, and the city of Babylon is a specific city, and it's still there today. But you know, it's bigger than a city. It's a principle. It's a spiritual being. And the city and the woman are the same. So Babylon is the whore, the prostitute. And Jerusalem, New Jerusalem, is the bride of Christ. So the city and the woman are the same throughout the Bible. And every woman in the Bible is one of those two women. They're either part of the bride or part of the whore. I suppose Eve was the bride of Christ, representing before she'd sinned, but when she'd sinned, she became the whore. She was the first prostitute. She corrupted herself for the benefits that she received. And so Ruth will say she's an example or a type and a shadow of the bride of Christ. Jezebel would be the whore. Some are very obvious, but every woman would fit in it. But every woman is also a city. It's either part of New Jerusalem or Babylon the Great. Well, this system will be with us until the return of Jesus. Jesus is the stone that hits the feet of the statue in Babylon, that Nebuchadnezzar's time. He had a dream and Daniel interpreted it, and it was a statue. He was the head of gold, and there was the brass and the iron and the silver. And we're now in the system of the toes and the feet. And the stone that hits the feet and the whole statue collapses. Babylon falls, the head goes, everything goes when the stone hits the feet. And the stone is Jesus. When he returns, just before he returns, the system will be destroyed. Well, I'm going to look in this series the three manifestations in world history of Babylon. Obviously, it started in the Garden of Eden, and I'll show that in a few studies. But the first one world system was with Nimrod, the Tower of Babel. And Babel means the gate of God. And that's a clue to the underlying principle. It's a gateway to God. You know, a lot of pop songs, Stairway to Heaven. The Masons, they always show the staircase. It's a way for men to become gods. That's what Stairway to Heaven's about. It's not a literal thing. Alchemy, it's not turning base metals, lead and iron into gold. That's just a shadow. It's to turn base people, men, into gods. And that's what it's about. Let's build a tower so we can reach God, so we can become like God. They didn't want to get into heaven and climb up a ladder from the top of a tower and meet God. They wanted to become gods. That's the spirit of Babylon. And CERN, this portal, a gateway, opening up the sky, this Clydron, whatever it is, I forget the name now, but the CERN, the principle, is to make a gateway through into heaven so we can become gods. I'll look at that more in other studies. But it's counterfeit worship, Mystery Babylon. You know, it's the natural thing to do. If you haven't got a relationship with the true God, you'll have the religion of Babylon. If you don't worship the true God in spirit, then you'll worship another God and you're in Babylon. That's the alternative. It's natural to us. We'll see with Cain. When Cain stopped worshipping the real God and left the presence of God, he built his own alternative. He started to build cities. And then we had culture and music and commerce. All those things are a natural consequence of not worshipping the true God and the part of Babylon. So we'll look at that first Babylon. And then the second time that it manifests was in Nebuchadnezzar's time, when Babylon the first one with Nimrod, the whole world were worshipping in one place. There weren't many people on the planet. This was just a few generations after the flood. But now, after hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, Nebuchadnezzar, so this is just hundreds of years before Jesus, in the days of Daniel. And now Babylon was a world empire. And we see more types and shadows. Music now comes into the system of Babylon. Now idol worship comes into a system of Babylon. It doesn't talk about idol worship with Nimrod. It doesn't talk about music with Nimrod. But now we're getting more of the plan. As history unfolds, God reveals more of his plan. And so we'll see that music and culture and status all come into the system of Babylon. And the whole world representatives were meant to worship a statue. And that's exactly what happens in Babylon in the last one. That's the third one that we'll look at, and that's the one we're in now. And I believe only a remnant will escape it. This is the third Babylon that's manifest. I know there's little manifestations all throughout history. But I believe only a remnant will escape, because the deception will be so great that the signs of the last days is a great falling away and deception. Jesus said, let no man deceive you. Paul says, let no man deceive you, that day will come. There's so many warnings about deception in the last days. Only a remnant will escape it. You know, the whole world and almost the whole of the church will be part of this Babylon system. Most have already been seduced by this prostitute. Let me read you from Timothy 3. This is Paul talking to Timothy, young minister, and he said, these men having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women, laden with sins, led away with divers lusts. Ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. These are ministers representing God, ever learning, never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now as Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. And he's talking about these days, men in the church resisting the truth, men of corrupt minds, reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. In these last days when Babylon falls, these false prophets will be exposed. They have a form of godliness. So we're not talking about Buddha. We're not talking about Muhammad. He didn't have a form of godliness. It's people who have a form of godliness but deny the power thereof. They're not living a holy life. They're not living the Sermon on the Mount, but they're preaching wonderful sermons, and they may have signs and wonders. They shall proceed no further. They'll all be exposed. The tares and the wheat grow together. We don't have to worry about them. Jesus said, leave them. When you rip out a false prophet, you also rip out some of the wheat, because the roots are entangled. And so we leave it till Babylon falls, and then they'll be exposed. So I am now waiting, I believe, this is 2021, I believe that I will see this statue set up in my lifetime. 10, 20 years ago, I thought maybe my children will see the man of sin be revealed. But now I believe it's possible that even at my age, if God spares me, that I could see it set up. The world's fast closing in, the net is closing. Darkness is coming upon the face of the earth where we won't be able to work anymore. I'm coming to a close, but I'm just introducing Babylon in this series. You know, Babylon, the whore, is a beautiful woman. The outward attire is attractive, alluring. But in her hand is a cup full of abominations and blasphemies. In Revelation, it describes her. And she's attired in gold and silver, precious stones and pearls. That's the attire of the bride of Christ. New Jerusalem, the streets paved with gold, the 12 foundations of precious stones. We're going to walk on the streets of gold, aren't we? The pearly gates. So the bride and the whore look exactly the same. It's only when you look into the cup that God's made all the world drink. It's only when you look in the cup there's abominations, but you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know from looking at the whore. She's very attractive. You know, outwardly the church is prospering. Babylon's prospering. There's more Christians on the planet now, I suppose, than in world history. I believe there's 1 million tongue-speaking Christians, even in Great Britain. Outwardly, the church is prospering, advancing. You know, but the substance, the life of Christ, sadly missing. Why? Because we've brought finance into the church. We've brought politics into the church. We have voted. We've brought culture and music and the arts into the church, and they've seduced it. So outwardly we're prospering, but the life of Christ is sadly missing. And all religions are daughters of Babylon. I came across something. I've been studying Babylon for a long time now, and I know the Jesuits have taken over everything politics. They run the world politics and finance. The Jesuits are behind the Catholic Church. The Black Pope runs the White Pope. The present Pope's only a puppet for the Black Pope. And I'll explain all these things in later studies. So if I say things that seem outrageous, just please bear with me and go through the series and decide afterwards. And if you think that my facts are wrong, that's all right. But, you know, don't write me off because I say things that I've not yet substantiated. But I've been studying the charismatic movement lately, and, you know, they've been infiltrated by Babylon. From the beginning, from the 60s, the charismatic movement have been infiltrated by the Jesuits. So I'm just going to read some things to close. And these are from the Catholic website, the Vatican website. So it's not some crackpot person, conspiracy theories. It's not what I think or what somebody said. This is from the Catholic Church. They're taken from the Vatican website. You can check. So let me read you these quotes. Along the way, I encountered many Jesuits involved in the charismatic movement, including Father Robert Farrisy, George Maloney and Matthew Lynn. There is much complementarity between Ignatian discernment of spirits and the emphasis on the experience of the Holy Spirit in the charismatic renewal. They're not talking about the Pentecostal church. Go back again, Joni, because I'm going to... They're not talking about the Pentecostal church. I believe that was a true revival. But the charismatic revival was, I believe, initiated, if not initiated, seduced early on by the Jesuits. Ignatian discernment of spirits, what's that about? Well, Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Jesuits, and he had a form of brainwashing for his subjects, the priests. It's unbelievable. If you read the Jesuit oath, and I suggest you do, the oath that they make, and they have mind control. It's almost like the monarch control that they use on these modern pop stars to control them and absolutely subjugate their own spirit. So they're puppets. They do whatever they say. The Jesuits say they're willing to plunder and murder and rape and embezzle, do anything. To a Jew, there'll be Jews. To a charismatic Christian, there'll be charismatic. To the law, there'll be a judge. Most of the Jesuits were in plain clothes, not in ecclesiastical garb. And they're everywhere, and they're willing to do it because they've been brainwashed. They will do anything. The means justify the end is a Jesuit phrase. It's for the greater glory of God. So it doesn't matter what you do, whether you assassinate a president, whether you, on the Titanic, and you cause the ship to hit an iceberg purposely, you'll do whatever it takes because you're a robot to the Catholic Church, and it's for the greater glory of God, so you'll get your reward. That's how they think. Can you believe it? It says they're very complimentary. The Ignatian discernment of spirits and the emphasis on the experience of the Holy Ghost in the charismatic renewal. What a claim that is. And the next page. Senior church leaders such as Cardinal Leon Joseph Sunans were active in the charismatic renewal. Father Renario Catalamassa, the preacher to the papal household since the pontificate St. John Paul II, is also active in the renewal. Pope Francis commissioned Charis, a new unified service under the dicastery for laity, family and life that the Church instituted on Pentecost in 2019. Father Alexandre Awe Mello, Secretary of the Dicastery, told Vatican News, the Pope wanted Charis to be established by the Holy See so that those in the charismatic renewal and the whole Church would know that the charismatic renewal belongs fully to the universal Church. That's what they say. The Pope wanted everyone to know that the charismatic renewal belongs fully to the universal Church, because to the Catholics there's only one Church. One of the essential points emphasised by the Holy Father is the importance of communion. That is, we're not talking about the bread and the wine communion relationship, the unity in diversity. That's a Jesuit phrase, unity in diversity. It's very, very dangerous. We're all one, the one world church. Pope Francis also calls for the charismatic renewal to return to its ecumenical roots, return to the Catholic Church. That's why Kenneth Copeland had the Pope's emissary talked to them and said, we're all Catholics now. That is to work proactively towards Christian unity. That means proactively towards the Catholic Church, the universal one Church, the Church of Babylon. This is something that was very much present at the birth of the charismatic renewal. So it's not just that they've seduced it along the way. It was there at the birth of the charismatic renewal, and which in many places was gradually set aside. So they say it's time to get back to the universal Church. Well, I'll leave you with that. I've got much more to say about the Catholic Church and religion and politics as we go through the series. The next one's called Babylon and Egypt. I want to show the difference between Babylon and Egypt. Lord, please help us. I know I say things that many Christians will not understand and not receive because they've been brainwashed by the church system, brainwashed by the doctrines of their denominations. But I pray, Father, you'll open my eyes and open their eyes to start to read what is actually in the Bible, and to not listen to the media, but to compare what's happening in the world now with your written word, so that we're not deceived in these last days. Father, please help us. I ask it in your name. Amen. God bless you. I hope you tune in to the next one, Babylon and Egypt. Have a wonderful week.